Okay, Dr. Patrick Mardini of the Lebanese Institute for Market Studies. You are the president and founder, is that correct?
Yes, sir.
I know there's a lot going on right now in Lebanon and Beirut, but I wanted to start by just having you sort of explain what the Institute does and why you founded it and what your priorities are.
So the Lebanese Institute for Market Studies is a free market think tank. We promote market-oriented policies. So our work is divided into research. We actually check what are the problems facing Lebanon, and we try to figure out solutions, market-friendly solutions. Then we promote those ideas. We have a wide media exposure. We are basically everywhere on TV, radio, and in newspapers. And then we reach out to policymakers and try to advocate for those policy reforms in order to have them done. So we've been working on several issues. Electricity is one of them. The devaluation of the Lebanese currency is another one. Most of our work is focused on privatization, competition, smaller government, basically more private initiative, less restrictions and interventionism.
And unfortunately, right now, it seems like there are way too many opportunities to introduce market reforms into the Lebanese economy. And I think a lot of, certainly a lot of Americans, but I think globally, a lot of people maybe haven't been paying attention to the economic crisis in Lebanon until the explosion in the port of Beirut. Tell us briefly what happened.
So about the crisis or the explosion?
The explosion.
Okay, so it seems that a heavy quantity of ammonium nitrate was stored at the port of Beirut. Now, this is really interesting because the port of Beirut is in the middle of a very crowded area, and this material can become potentially explosive if it has been mixed up with some kind of fuel or a kind of combustible, right? But what is really interesting is that a private company would have never stored this type of material in one of the most expensive residential areas in the countries, right? And it has been laying down there for the past 6 years for free, for no storage cost. And that's really crazy. And it shows you how the government management of those kind of assets can be very, very damaging. And we saw it, right? It's not only it was mismanaged, misstored. Why was it over there? I mean, it doesn't make any sense from an economic perspective to have those materials over there. So basically, it seems that, I mean, the dominant narrative, and you have a lot of speculations around it, but the dominant narrative is that a ship of ammonium nitrate have been basically seized along the coast of Lebanon. They seized the merchandise, stored them in hangar 12, and now we had a small fire in hangar 9, which led to some fireworks, and those fireworks started the biggest explosion. So it is an accident theory. And since it is an accident, it means that there is a mismanagement of the whole thing, right? How they are stored, why the accident happened. And this kind of, this accident led to the resignation of the Lebanese government. That's in a nutshell. Now, many people are challenging this narrative. They look at the shape and the color of the smoke yielded by the explosion, and they say that there have been some, military materials burning alongside the ammonium nitrate, right? And some people go as far as saying that it was actually an attack, a bomb that triggered the explosion. But this is not really the dominant theory. This is like the conspiracy theory, I would say. But that might end up being the right one. I mean, we still don't have the result of the investigation, right?
Yeah, we don't know that, but we do know for certain that the bureaucracy and corruption in government led to this insane outcome where you had this very explosive material sitting in the center of your city for years.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And the port of Beirut have always been famous in Lebanon with the nickname of the Alibaba Grotto. And the Alibaba Grotto is where you have the 40 thieves, right? That's where, I mean, right? And it means that it has always been a place for corruption, right? People smuggles many things in and out through the port of Beirut. If you look at the routine, if you look at, I mean, it takes you 180 hours to get your merchandise if you are importing goods compared to 9 hours in developed countries. And for paperwork, it takes you 72 hours for port compliance, while in other countries, I mean, in more developed countries, it takes you around 3 or 4 hours, right? So this long procedures, those many papers, they lead to a lot of corruption, a lot of bribes, but also a lot of smuggling. And it has always been known in Lebanon that this part is very, very corrupt. Like most government institutions in Lebanon, I mean, entrenched corruption is a big problem in the country, and the port have been the crown jewel of this corruption, and the result, we saw it.
The bomb, I shouldn't call it a bomb, the explosion was devastating, though, because it was in the city center. The last number I saw was some 150 people that we know about were killed in the explosion. Is your family safe?
Yes, we live in the northern part of Lebanon, not in Beirut. So we were really spared. My sister happened to I mean, she was in Beirut when the explosion took place. She was at a mall. The whole mall collapsed, but she is safe. She is unharmed. Her car has been damaged, but that's, I mean, that's not a big deal compared to the other damages that the whole city have been suffering. I think that we have been spared. Thanks God.
I want to get back to the question of government corruption and financial mismanagement, because this latest episode is really just part of a perfect storm that's been happening for years. But one story that I thought was interesting and sort of an uplifting, promising story about the people, the Lebanese people, is that they knew in the aftermath of this explosion that the government was incapable, unwilling, financially unable to do anything about cleaning up Beirut. So they've swarmed to the city, and they've taken that responsibility for themselves, kind of crowdsourcing, cleaning up and helping and trying to bring back to a semblance of normal. Is that typical of the Lebanese people, or is that a new response to this government?
I think it's a new, I mean, we have never witnessed a similar accident before, so you cannot compare in order to assess if this is a new kind of attitude or it has always been like that. But this solidarity movement that took place have been fabulous. I mean, the whole city have been destroyed, the poor have been destroyed. I walked through the streets of Beirut, East Beirut, where the blast had the most impact. I mean, you can see all the building destroyed, no glasses on the windows, everything is in the street. And especially young people, you see them with shovels, you see them in the street cleaning up, helping families. It was amazing, right? I mean, in this moment of despair, you see those, especially young people, going there and trying to help. You can see the families crying, because they feel that they are not left alone. This moment was really fascinating, right? So yeah, in the past we've had some wars, right? But wars usually take a long time. It takes you 30 years to start a war and finish it. While this happened like instantly, brutally, in a couple of seconds, and it was done. And then everybody went systematically to the street. And this kind of reaction actually contrasts with the government reaction, where the government did not do anything. Basically, they just sent some military to organize the traffic, right? That's all what they did. And people were left alone, basically, to help each other so far. And now they actually kind of instaured a new law, which is really weird, a new decision, which is like any group who is trying to do a work on the ground, help the people, they should register and obtain a registration in order to be allowed to operate. So now they are actually putting restrictions on the work of those people who volunteer and who want to do good work. So the government cannot do anything, doesn't want to do anything, and now they don't let anybody also do anything, and that's really crazy. But I mean, those restrictions are not very harsh so far. For now, they just ask people to register, right? To put their name on a list. Let's see the next step. What will it be?
Kind of a tragic metaphor where the people have stepped up and essentially privatized government services because they knew it couldn't be done from the top down, so they're doing it from the bottom up. And the government comes in and says, well, and I'll use an American word, you need a license to do this. And our regulatory system loves to force everyone to be registered because they hate the competition. And I think that's what's really going on there. It reminds me of the first time we met at the Atlas Network several years ago. You were pitching an idea to privatize the provision of energy and the electrical grid in Lebanon. Talk about that project, because I think it applies to a lot of the problems that you're seeing in your country today.
So in Lebanon, when I did the pitch, we had 12 hours of daily blackouts, right? So if you live in Lebanon, then you have electricity for only 12 hours. However, everybody has a small generator. Actually, you have some small entrepreneurs who sell subscription service. You subscribe to the generation service. And so you actually have 24 hours, half of it supplied regularly by a big factory, by a big power plant. And the other half is supplied by a small entrepreneur who sells you subscription at a very high price, right? Now, this subscription part was illegal and is still illegal, actually, because the government has the monopoly of producing, distributing, and selling electricity across the country. So if there is an entrepreneur willing to build a power plant and sell electricity to people, they were not allowed, right? So the government was unable to provide electricity and unwilling to let anybody else do it, basically, and that was the setting initially. So what we have been pushing for was to legalize electricity in Lebanon, because it's illegal to produce electricity in Lebanon if you are not the government, right? And I mean, the reason they wanted to be a government monopoly because of entrenched corruption. Again, the government had a plan of like $4.5 billion to build power plant and renew, and they have been spending fortunes on the sector year after year without actually improving the service, because as long as the problem persists, they can spend even more on it, and that's how government works. So basically, we come in and we said, you know what, government should stop spending. If you want the sector to be fixed, government should get out of it, let private companies come in, independent power producers, let them come in, produce electricity and sell it. We've been pushing for that, and we got a law in May 2019, so like last year, a year ago, Law 129, and this law allows private companies to come in, produce electricity in a BOT format, build, operate, transfer format, where a private company will come in, build an electricity power plant from their own money, manage the electricity, sell the electricity basically, and then get some profit. And after 30 years or like a certain lapse of time, this factory would go back to the government. Now, I would have preferred to go to a BOO model, build, operate, own, where the factory will always stay within the private entity. That's how you ensure proper maintenance and long life and renewal of all the equipment. But you need to take it step by step, right? So first you convince them of a BOT model, and then like in a couple of years you say, you know what, the private sector have actually fixed it. Why don't we go one step further and just keep it with them and let's not recover it? So this was the setting in 2019. We were very excited to have the law, and then Lebanon falls in a harsh economic recession, deep financial crisis. Banks are all in a situation of default. The country has been downgraded massively. Government defaulted on the payment of debt, $90 billion debt. The government defaulted, and mostly the holders of the government debt were Lebanese banks. So since banks cannot get their money from the public sector, from the government and the central bank. They cannot pay depositors anymore. So the whole country collapsed, basically. And this was before the explosion and before COVID-19. And then on top of the depression, basically, you have COVID-19. And then on top of all of that, you have the explosion. So although we have a law that allows private electricity generation, unfortunately, it was not implemented yet because of all those troubles that came, in the middle, basically.
It sounds like you need a lot more privatization quickly to dig out of that hole. But let's talk about sovereign debt, because I feel like that's the core problem here, or at least a core symptom of the problem. The last I checked, it was 183% of GDP. I'm sure it's much higher than that now because of COVID and the economic collapse. Why is the government so deep in debt that it defaulted?
I can do a very long interpretation of that, but I will try to cut the long story short. So the government business model since the 90s have been to borrow money and spend on the public sector, right? On mostly electricity, telecom, roads, everything, all the public sector, all the things that government manage, a huge number of public sector employees, and a lot of public tenders and public contracts. And you had a lot of corruption in all those contracts. And you had a lot of clientelism in public sector employment, where basically you employ somebody because his family will vote for you in the election. That's how the system have been set since the 90s, right? So basically the business model of all Lebanese politicians was to actually get into power, spend a lot of money to buy up your vote, and then get re-elected. That's in simple terms. Now I can go back to the Civil War and retrace the roots of that model. How did we emerge? But I don't think it would be interesting for you unless you want me to talk more about it. Now, so basically the government have been building up debt year after year, and we got into a very high level of public debt. The public debt became unsustainable. I mean, we had high economic growth, so you could justify high debt if you had high growth. You could say, you know what, one day I will be able to pay it. But then in 2011, we got a reduction in growth. Before 2011, we were growing at an 8% rate per year. After 2011, the war in Syria, which is a neighboring country, growth went down to 2% per year. And then in the past 2 years, the growth went down to zero, right? And we entered a recession in 2019. So with a high debt, when you enter a recession, your debt becomes unsustainable. The government is unable to pay back debt because you are not generating enough growth. And so basically banks and foreign investors, foreign market decided that they don't want to lend government money anymore. And government was basically addicted to borrowing, right? We were running, and we are still running a fiscal deficit, a huge fiscal deficit. The government spends much more than the income. They need to borrow year after year. If you don't give them money, well, they cannot continue. And that's how the whole system collapsed. And this kind of mechanism normally should lead you to do some structural reform, namely cut your spending, right, in order to match it with your income. Instead of doing that, what they are doing now is financing those spending with inflation. And that's why Lebanon entered hyperinflation a couple of months ago. And basically the Lebanese pound lost around 80% of its value, right? So you are totally correct. The root cause of the problem is the high debt due to the fiscal deficit, right? So you built up debt to finance your fiscal deficit. And when you were unable to borrow money anymore, they started to print money to finance this deficit. That's where we are today.
It's a classic. I'm an Austrian economist by training, and it's a classic cautionary story about what happens when you tax as much as you can tax. So you stop taxing and you start borrowing. You borrow as much as you can borrow, and eventually no one will loan you money anymore. And then you start debasing the currency, all of which is a massive scheme to steal from the working class to sort of finance the insiders and the political class. And I want Americans to hear that story, because we do all of the same things, and we're spoiled in the sense that we haven't really paid a price for that yet, but it's happening in your country right before your eyes.
And when it happens brutally. You don't feel it. It happens like one shot, right? So people were actually used to have a good standard of living, an acceptable standard of living in Lebanon, right? And with an 80% devaluation of the currency, people became poor in a blink of an eye, basically, right? Like simply the same salary that you used to make last year or last month, now it can buy you only 20% of what it used to buy you before. So basically, you become very poor. And usually those kind of crises, I mean, what happened in Lebanon is that this massive devaluation of the currency comes with a banking crisis, meaning that your savings, you cannot recover them anymore. Even if you saved your money, I mean, if you saved your money in the local currency, you lost the value of your savings, right? You lost 80% of the value of your saving. But even if you have saved your money in another currency, in Lebanon, dollarization was around 76%. So people kept their money, their savings in dollar because they did not trust the government, because they were afraid the government would start printing money. But then what happened is that the banks collapsed and people are unable to recover their savings. So people simultaneously lost their jobs because of the recession and business closures, lost their income, and lost their life saving. And everything happened simultaneously, and that's what you call the crisis. And then if you live in Beirut, you also lost your house and your office or your shop and your car because of the explosion. So imagine you are somebody who lives in Beirut. You've already lost the money at the bank account. You've already lost your income and your job. You had diversified your portfolio. You've probably bought an apartment, a car, kept some money in the bank, and probably opened a shop or something. Well, you lost everything simultaneously, and that's a big problem. I mean, that's a tragedy.
And Terry and I have a friend, Leopold, who lost all of his savings. His parents lost everything they had, and they would have been the middle class of Lebanon. So I think every person needs to understand, like, I know you're a professor of finance and I'm an economist, and we will prattle on about debt and inflation and mismanagement of currency. And for a lot of people, that's kind of a dry subject. It's kind of boring, but this is where it translates into human loss of life, loss of prosperity, and loss of everything that we all work for. So I think that, and I should add, and you mentioned this, but on top of all of that, the COVID lockdowns created massive unemployment beyond where you were at the beginning of the year. Isn't that right?
Yes. Lebanon relies heavily on tourism. That's like the most dynamic industry. We have nice beaches. Usually people come in summer to enjoy their time. You have good restaurants, cafes, pubs, nightclubs. I mean, it's a nice city to go out, good hotels. And then you had the recession. All those businesses, all this tourism industry was suffering, basically, or the restaurants were really suffering. And then you got COVID with the lockdown. So it was like, it killed them, basically, right? And especially that the lockdown meant that people should stay at home. Shops were not allowed, restaurants were not allowed to open, only for delivery, but, you don't have seating. And then they closed the airport. And without airport, you cannot have any tourists coming in. And Lebanon has a huge diaspora, and those people come in summer to enjoy their time and see their family. It was impossible this year. So actually, the businesses that were suffering already were actually demolished with the lockdown due to the virus. But then again, you still had your shop, you still had your restaurant, you still had your hotel, and you said, you know what, this year maybe we'll make a lot of losses, but next year things might get better. And then you had the explosion where the whole hotel comes down to earth, right? And the whole thing is destroyed. So we used to have a problem where we used to have a capital that is not generating income, right? You used to have this physical capital that was not working. Now we lost this actual physical capital with the explosion, and people who have savings at the bank, they cannot recover their savings in order to fix this capital because of the banking crisis. And the banking crisis simply means that banks took people money, lend them to the government, and the government wasted this money, and now this money is not available anymore, right? So what can we do? We can just print new money and give it to you, thus hyperinflation. So basically people lost their saving. I mean, they lost everything simultaneously and really quickly, and it was massive and quick.
Wow. So I don't want to put any pressure on you, but I feel like you, as the head of the preeminent free market institute in Lebanon, you got to fix this problem for us, and I feel like there's a solution here in exactly what you did with electricity reform, starting with the port of Beirut. What should we do there?
So we have been, I mean, after the explosion, the next day we started promoting privatizing the port, but then opening all Lebanese ports to competition, right? In Lebanon, we have three small ports and one big port, which is the port of Beirut. And I believe that if we want to wait for the government to fix the port of Beirut, Beirut will never have a port again. The government won't be able to do that. They would raise money, spend them year after year, pretending to want to fix the port, but they will never fix it, right? The only way to fix the port quickly and have it working better than before is to actually privatize it. I think that's the only choice we have. But then not only privatize it, we have three other ports in other regions in Lebanon, one to the north and two to the south. Privatize them as well and let them compete. And if the port of Beirut service importers and it take them 180 hours to get their good out and 72 hours to finish with compliance measures, right? Maybe the port of Tripoli can do better, and then you will shift the business to the port of Tripoli, and then this would give an incentive to the port of Beirut to improve the service. And if by any chance the port of Beirut wastes very valuable space storing explosive good at the port, then they will be wasting money. And if an accident like this happens in the future and the port is privately managed, at least the private company would be accountable and can pay back the victim, while now the government is accountable and the government won't pay anyone because the government does not have any money. Anyway, the government will never sue itself, right? So basically, I think that privatization of all Lebanese ports and opening them to competition should be the cornerstone of rebuilding the ports. However, you have, as I said, it's Alibaba and it's the house of the 40 thieves, and those 40 thieves are mostly statesmen and ministers and political leaders. So it's very hard to convince them to drop a very lucrative business model, and that's the fight we need to do.
Well, you obviously had some success with electricity, and I assume that same sort of personal corruption dominated that industry as well. And I have this theory, and maybe it's more of a hope than a theory, that government will eventually do the right thing after they've exhausted every single other option. And it sounds like the Lebanese government has done everything wrong for so long. Maybe they have to do the right thing because they don't really have any choices, and I hope that's true.
I hope. The thing is, they get really good in creating new wrong options every time. So if you want to wait for them, they can get very creative. What I think is awareness is very important, right? If the public understands clearly that the only reason they want this sport to be government owned is to do corruptions then they would feel that their seats in the parliament and in the cabinet are in danger, and they might end up doing the right thing. So awareness is very, very important. And in Lebanon, it's usually harder to raise awareness because any topic that you discuss, political parties tend to make it look like an attack on their sect, on their religion, right? They bring it to identity politics so that you would forget the real corruption behind it. So if I attack you, you would say, oh, you are attacking me because I'm a Christian American, right? And then you get all the identity group rally around you, basically, and that's how they get away with it. So you need to do, you need to raise awareness, but you need to take this variable into consideration, and you need to do it in a clever way.
There was a protest. One of the attempts. You know this story, I'm sure. One of the attempts by the government to close the financial gap was a new tax on WhatsApp services, which I'm sure are absolutely a lifeline, communications lifeline in Lebanon, as they are in most of the world. And you had these massive protests where all of the sects came together, and they were sort of proud of the fact that they had unified, and they finally had a common enemy. And a lot of the comments were quite liberty based, quite market based, because they just didn't trust the government anymore. So they were going to come together and try to solve this problem through protesting. Is that an opportunity for you?
Well, it is very, I mean, what happened was very important because the population was fed up with taxes, right? And people like to call it the WhatsApp revolution, and I like to call it the taxes revolution, because it's not the WhatsApp, it's the tax on WhatsApp that triggered. People actually revolted against taxation. That's what happened, right? Now, it happened that the tax was on WhatsApp. It could have been on something else. The reaction would have been the same. And yes, indeed, we had, I mean, they call it the revolution in Lebanon. It was a protest, but people like to exaggerate things. So they call it a revolution. And this revolution indeed brought people from different sectarian perspective. Now, governments are really good at breaking down protests, right? They know how to bring protesters against each other, right? And then try to get religion and sectarianism into the protest in order to break them down along sectarian lines, right? And government is really good at that, so they did that extensively. And on the other hand, they used the secret services to basically infiltrate all those groups, and they toughened up the police and the crackdown on protesters. So they had a nice cocktail of different ways to basically kill this movement, and they kind of managed to weaken it a lot. But then after the explosion, people went back to the street of Beirut. People went back to the street. They were fed up, and the first revolution got down the Hariri government, and the explosion is in Beirut also got down. I mean, the Diab government stepped down as well. So the protests have already taken down two governments, I would say. Protesters would love to take down the parliament and organize early elections, because with the same parliament, you'll have the same cabinet with different names, but the same political parties controlling the cabinet, right? And protesters are unhappy with that. And I think that what politicians figured out is that let's sacrifice the government so that we can keep the parliament, right? And we won't have elections until 2022. That's a long time from now. And so yeah, and that's where we are politically.
Are you optimistic that you can get change?
I do believe that the current political parties that are represented in the government are highly representative within the population. It will be very hard to bring them down because simply they rely extensively on sectarian solidarity, on identity politics, basically, right? So I am a Christian, and thus you should vote for me even if I am corrupt, because the alternative would be the Muslims taking power in Lebanon. And same thing in the Muslims group, in the Shia group, in the Sunni group, in the Druze group, right? And every political leader tries to picture himself as the defender of the sect and the protector of the sect against the aggression or the dominance of the other religions in the country. And that's why basically people will systematically vote for him, even if he is corrupt. And I think that this thing still exists, and it will exist. And now it's sleeping a little bit because you don't have election, but before election, political leaders are really good in bringing it up, right, and investing in this sentiment, in this feeling, in order to get people to vote for them. This being said, I do think that many people are fed up with this system, and I think that the degree or the number of people fed up with this system is increasing. Now, will it be high enough to overrule the whole political class? I really doubt, but I do think that if we have elections today, then protesters will have a big group in the parliament that can change the political game, flip it one way into or another. They won't overrule everybody, but they will have a larger space in the parliament that might help them make some changes.
Where do people find out more? You guys have done so much work on all of the issues we're talking about. Where can people find out more about the work that you do?
So we have a website, www.limslb.com. So limslb.com. And we also have a Facebook page, which is the same, like Facebook/LIMSLB, right? So on the Facebook, now many of the content is in Arabic, right? Most of the content is in Arabic, but there is always an English. On the Facebook page, we are trying to provide English content, right? So like you do an interview with the TV, and the interview would be in Arabic, but you will have a small summary in English on the Facebook post, right? So we are trying to provide some English content as well, but the Arabic content is much more extensive, I would say.
Okay, well, thank you, Patrick. Be safe, and please keep fighting for these principles. It really matters.
Thank you. Real pleasure talking to you, and let's hope for the best.
Always. We have to, right?
Absolutely.
Thanks for watching Kibbe on Liberty. By now, you know this is the most important event of your week, so make sure you subscribe on YouTube. Click the little bell so you get notifications. Kibbe on Liberty, mostly honest conversations with mostly interesting people.